All right. The International Symposium on Girls in Conflict with the Law is the work of the following organizations. The Dui Hua Foundation is a nonprofit organization that brings clemency and better treatment to at-risk detainees through dialogue. Patricia Lee is the managing attorney for the Juvenile Division of the San Francisco Public Defender's Office and today's moderator. Penal Reform International is a non-governmental organization working globally to promote criminal justice systems that uphold human rights for all and do no harm. And finally, the Center for Criminology and the Center for Comparative and Public Law of the University of Hong Kong are the remaining partners. Today's webinar would not be, and the symposium as a whole would not be possible without support from the following organizations: the Canada Fund for Local Initiatives, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Netherlands, two private funds, the Alice Lamb Memorial Fund and Mark Headley and Christina Pell. And the symposium is also supported by organizations that give to Dui Hua's core work. So those come from the Dui Hua Special Program Development Fund, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Denmark, SIDA, the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency, and the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Today's moderator, Patricia Lee, has been Deputy Public Defender in San Francisco since 1978 and has been practicing in the juvenile courts since 1981. She is currently the managing attorney for the Juvenile Division of the San Francisco Public Defender's Office. I will now turn things over to you, Patty.
Thank you, Joshua. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good evening. I wanted to also note that this is the 8th webinar and symposium, but I wanted to also encourage you to attend our upcoming symposium events. So on February 15th, we have Finding and Calls to Justice with a focus on Indigenous girls and youth in Canada and in the United States. February 23rd, we have a symposium on sex trafficking. And to be announced, hopefully very soon, sexual violence, the view from Glasgow. And the last symposium will be the view from Beijing. So we have a lot in store. Encourage you to continue attending these events. And for today's presentation, we are very, very excited to present the preeminent photojournalist, Richard Ross. He is an activist, photographer, and distinguished research professor of art based in Santa Barbara, California. He is a creator of Juvenile-in-Justice. His work turns a lens on the placement and treatment of American juveniles, and he empowers the voices of the youth, the many of youth who are incarcerated. So he provides a visual tool to lead to the decarceration of youth throughout the United States and across the world. And next stop on our tour is Kasie Lee. I'm very honored to have worked with Kasie through the years, and she is now the new Assistant District Attorney for the City and County of San Francisco. She is a certified criminal law specialist. She is a former public defender of the Los Angeles County Public Defender's Office, and she's handled complex cases. And she will give you a short preview on the law of children who've been sexually trafficked and exploited. And our final stop on our tour this morning will be Michelle DeYoung, our girl social worker extraordinaire from the San Francisco Public Defender's Office. And she will provide you with a day in the life of a social worker as a girl social worker in San Francisco. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to Richard Ross. Thank you, Richard.
You're muted, Richard. If you could unmute quickly and then get your slides up. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Dui Hua.
There we go.
There we go. We okay?
Yep, looks good.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. My whole focus for the last 15 years has been interviewing these kids and interviewing these kids and being a co-conspirator with them in terms of trying to be the conduit for their voice. So I've been to 35 different states. I have interviewed over 1,000 kids. It's taken more than 15 years. And it's a project that began, I know exactly where it began, but I'm not quite sure when it ends. But the easiest thing to introduce me is Judy Woodruff did a little interview with me earlier in the year. And let me give you a 3-minute piece that was just on PBS.
Photographer Richard Ross has documented the U.S. juvenile justice system for the better part of a decade. In tonight's Brief but Spectacular, Ross shares what it feels like to honor the voices of children behind bars. His books, Juvie Talk and Girls in Justice, are available online.
I went to a juvenile detention center in Texas, and I was used to photographing architecture, but then all of a sudden I started talking to a couple of kids there that were very fragile, didn't speak any English, and I realized that I was the conduit for their voice. When I would go into these institutions, I would knock on the door of the cell, I would take off my shoes, I would ask for permission to come in, and then I would sit on the floor of the cell. I would give that child authority physically above me. And these were usually teenagers, and they were isolated, bored, lonely, and somebody interested in paying attention to them, they loved it. These kids all live under the umbrella of trauma, poverty, abuse, neglect, and I'm trying to figure out the world where they get the right resources to help them and they don't go into the deeper end of the system. Every one of these children need mental health services. These are kids without a voice, from families without resources, from communities without power, and that's got to change somehow. Getting the images into the hands of the right people to affect change is the battle that I do. The Senate and the House was voting to renew the act that kept children in separate courts. There was an exhibition of my work in the Capitol Rotunda, and then when the actual vote was taking place, Senators Grassley and Durbin both had copies of my book when they were voting. I create these images because data, while it's incredibly important, exists in fluorescent sterility, yearning for a fragile voice to make it comprehensible on human terms. When you have kids from one zip code that are more likely to go to prison than college, then society has failed them rather than they have failed us. So instead of figuring out how to change these kids to fit into our institutions, we have to rearrange our thinking and figure out how our institutions change to fit these kids. You've seen these images. You have a glimpse of who these kids are. Ask yourself, what would you do if this was your kid? My name is Richard Ross, and this is my brief but spectacular take on juvenile injustice in America.
Brief but spectacular. I apologize for that title, but it does give a pretty good overview, and professionals at editing and presenting are important. So I've photographed all over the place, and then as part of it, you look at isolation cells. And any institution might say, well, it's an anomaly, it's a timeout room, it's administrative segregation, any number of words, but when you put them all together, and I can do that in a compelling and artistic fashion that pulls you in. I'm an artist, I know visuals, I know how to sell things. That's what a visual artist can do. I don't just give data. When you put a 10-year-old into a room like this, and a steel door closes. You can hear the sound, you can feel the cold, and then 4 deadbolts are thrown across there. How much damage does it do to these kids? How do you imagine that you're doing something good? But institutions are hoarders of bad habits, so they keep on doing it and doing it. My role has been to get into these places, which takes endless emails, endless phone calls, endless who knows who. I wear a journalistic hat. I wear a professorial hat. I do anything possible, and I am relentless in terms of getting into these places. When people have said, you'll never be able to do it, well, I think the legal system comes from a background of precedent, whereas artists feel like they have to do what is unprecedented. And then once you get in there, you have to very quickly develop trust with the kid. And I do that by knocking on the door, taking off my shoes, asking for permission, and sitting on the floor and give these kids power over me. So who are these kids? This is the way the media has portrayed these kids as very violent gangbangers that are terrifying, that are going to come and assault, sexually, physical, take away all your resources. These are immigrants. This is the way the media presents it. So I try to show the actuality of who these kids are. On the left is a 5th grader that got into an argument with a kid in class, was in the principal's office, and then ate a muffin on the principal's desk, and ended up at 10 o'clock in the morning in a detention center. Well, the director of the detention center asked if she could use the image, sent out that image to all the principals in her district, and said, this is no place for these kids. You settle any issue like that within your classroom or within your office, but you don't have protocols that send them here because it damages them. I do comparisons. The left is an image that I shot at Abu Ghraib in Iraq. The right is a juvenile detention center in Hawaii. The right is one of my images from Guantanamo, Delta Camp, where they hold the world's worst alleged terrorists. On the left is a juvenile detention center in Texas. What's the difference between the two? It's exactly the same construction, but for the alleged terrorists, they have a light, they have a window. How do we do this to our children? That's what these comparisons will ask. And then I have to figure out where to present them in order to get the maximum impact. But visuals count. Simple visuals are important. But let me give you an example and let me act as a conduit and let a kid from Ferguson, Missouri speak in his own words.
I got shot. It was on the 22nd of April. Well, they shattered my thumb, because it went in my thumb and came out on my pinky, and hopefully they took a piece of bone out of my hip. They put it in my thumb, just like yesterday, but 2 days ago. It's all great. It's all going great. I'm still alive, so good.
It's all going great. I'm still alive. Well, that shows the lack of a prefrontal cortex. It shows an access to weapons. It shows violence. It shows a kid in isolation. All these things that we talk about in terms of data, one kid starts talking about it. Simple, simple stories, simple data. And I need to have this information repeatable for it to have effect. Every child 13 or 14 years old sentenced to life without parole for a non-homicide has been a person of color in the US. So I want students to think about these things, be able to read them and be able to read them and say to their friends, you know, I heard this and you're not going to believe it. And it sets up a conversation in terms of changing a discussion and changing a way a world thinks about these kids. For example, I went to Maryvale residential program. I asked the director, what percentage of the girls here have been sexually abused when they come here? What percentage? Everyone, all 88 of the girls in our custody have been sexually abused. It's hard to imagine these kids are perpetrators of crimes when you realize how much they're victims of crimes. The people that they were put in custody to love them or their family violated that love on the worst possible sense. So when you start thinking about these kids in these terms, it's one thing. But then when you go beyond that and you start having the first person story, again, this is a director talking about girls, but here in Georgia, a girl tells her story in the sense of first person singular. This is me, and it has different impact.
The first time I was sexually abused was at the age of probably around 5. They were with my mother, and I tried to tell her a few times, and she said I didn't know what I was talking about. I was too little. And when I finally the time when I actually finally gave up on trying to get to talk to her about it was when one of her boyfriends, after having raped me, left the room and slammed the door so hard that it didn't actually close. It kind of like swung back open. And I saw her sitting on the couch across from the doorway. And she looked at me and smiled, and I knew the whole time that she could hear me screaming.
The power of the voice, the power of telling the story from their own experience. And I try to have both audio, singular image, not confused, simple images. I want things to haunt you. And politically, in terms of getting the images to have impact, although so many overproportioned kids that are incarcerated are kids of color, I also make sure that I have some white girls, with the idea that the policymakers who are predominantly white men in this country, can easily dismiss this as a problem of the other. I want to have an image like this so that they can identify and say, oh, maybe we better do something about this because she looks familiar in terms of my own family, my own community, my own church, my own school. So I can't dismiss it as the other. I can't say, oh, well, it's that kid of color that's causing the problem. But again, let's hear a girl talk about her situation.
Can't lay down, gotta sit up. I can lay down at 7:30. They wake me up at 6 o'clock. If they see us laying down or falling asleep, then they take our mattress and covers. And my back really hurts.
And this is a girl where there are 50 girls being held. 49 of them are white. One African-American girl, she's held for 72 hours in isolation. They won't let her lie down on a mattress. And the director of the institution is saying she was intimidating the other girls. One African-American girl intimidating 49 white girls. I didn't see how that was possible, but I couldn't say, are you out of your mind? I had to make the case and get him to buy into a different way of thinking. So your strategies have to be to try to bring people into the fold rather than confronting them. Sometimes data can be really simple and present a case, and you could say, do you know Latino youth are 4 times more likely to receive an adult sentence for the same crime as white children? And African-American youth are 9 times more likely to receive an adult sentence for the same crime as a white child. So what do you think your policy of holding this African-American girl is accomplishing, and how does that stand with the data that's been collected? And you have a discussion. Basically, I feel like I am a conduit telling these kids stories. But the story that you have to tell essentially is when you can predict that an infant boy of color in a particular zip code is more likely to go to prison than to college. You have to be able to accept that it's our fault more than his. You have to be able to show that, look at this kid, African-American kid in a courtroom facing 2 white ADAs or public prosecutors. How does it feel? These are lonely, powerless people. This is a girl that was held for more than 6 weeks in isolation in an institution wearing a suicide tunic. Why was she wearing a suicide tunic? Because there was a horizontal band of red all across her cell. which very much looked like a tennis ball had been dipped in paint and placed there. But it's where she was beating her head against the wall. Can you imagine that? How do you deal with that? How do you talk to these kids? How do you deal with the institutions? How do you try to change it? It's almost impossible, but you have to bear witness and you have to show people in power, this is what you're doing. So I took this and I did this work in secret for about 5 years. Then the publisher, Rick MacArthur of Harper's Magazine, said, you can't be a mobile home trying to get all 50 states. These kids need attention now. So in 2012, this was published, and it started to gain national attention, more national attention than I think simply data would have done. But it also closed a lot of doors. But it became a much more public discussion rather than just driving my wife crazy with the project I was doing. And it became used in judicial subcommittee hearings, somewhat on the federal level, but a lot of the battle in the states is on the state and local level. So you have to figure out who the audience is. That's really critical for your information. We're working together today, and we know our audience is very specific and educated. But we also have within the audience a high school group from Chicago and other people beyond educators. This was at the Capitol when they were voting to extend the OJJDP. Rather than January 6th, this was a little more productive use of the Capitol Rotunda. I also published 3 books, which are available online, shameless plug, because the policymakers are older, male, and they feel the weight of the book is important. But in order to get to the policymakers, you have to get to the gatekeepers, who are the interns, younger, deal with social media. So some of our tweets, we have pushing 200,000 engagements. Some of our IG account, we can get upwards of 70,000 and more, 80,000. So it's shaping the conversation for another generation. This is at American University. I put the images on the walls rather than within the museums, because as Willie Loman said about why do you rob banks, it's because that's where the money is. I'm trying to be in places where the kids are, where the policymakers of the future are. I'm trying to shape the conversation for another generation. So the work will be up by on the walls of institutions that never thought they could put the work up. It's not about a commodity. It's not about artifact. It's about idea. I'll put them up on billboards. I'll work with other artists who like to do unprecedented things in dance performance. This is Bloomington, Indiana City Hall. So the city councilors have to go up the stairs and look at it every day. This is Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, where they had the Kids for Cash scandal, and 2 judges were sent to prison for owning a private juvenile detention center and sending kids to their private juvenile detention center. Well, there the district attorneys said, yeah, you could put it up in the courthouse. We won't argue with it. And I'll put up simple information, as simple as I can get it. And you have this information, and then I'll work with Brian Stevenson. It goes into the EJI Museum. Oprah, Brian are there looking at the image. It's on 60 Minutes. It gets to a wider audience. And now I'm going to beg for forgiveness from Dui Hua and show one of the images that was presented earlier in terms of text, general information, Penal Reform International. And that same information can be presented with an image where it's located personally as the story of a girl, which makes it more impactful, I think. Patty, forgive me. One of her slides from an earlier week, same information here, and it would be even more effective if this girl was saying, I am here for a technical violation. I am here for a status offense. I need mental health help. I come from probation. So things like that, and then you follow it with the kicker, costs for this 15-year-old girl more than $275,000. But one of the last things I'm going to do is show you, have you listen for a minute to Brian Gowdy, who was the attorney that spoke in front of the Supreme Court and argued Graham versus Florida. So Graham versus Florida was one of the seminal cases of you can't have a juvenile in a non-capital case be sentenced to die in prison. So I interviewed Brian, I interviewed Terrence Graham, I'm in a constant correspondence with him. These are all on a website, these are all being posted, and this is the 10th year anniversary of Graham versus Florida coming up. But Terrence is still in prison. We have these legal decisions, but they are people. So here's Brian speaking.
After Terrence's case, another case that I helped out in involved a 12-year-old was accused here in Duval County, and he was indicted by the grand jury. He was facing, this was pre-Miller, and so it was post-Graham, pre-Miller, so he was facing a mandatory life without parole. His name was Christian Fernandez, and Christian's now 17, but you know, when Christian was 12, the way I put it to people was by the time he was 12, he had a father who completely abandoned him, had no part in his life. He had a stepfather that abused him physically and that committed suicide in front of him. He had a mother who was only 12 when she had him, and she was wholly ill-equipped to raise him. You had DCF come in and investigate and do nothing about the situation. And the result of this whole environment that was created by all these adults was that Christian was, left at home with his younger siblings one day, and his 2-year-old sibling unfortunately died. You know, he was supposed to be looking after all these younger siblings at age 12. And I say, all these people have a part to play in this. His father who was absent, his stepfather who abused him and committed suicide in front of him, his mother who did, really nothing to rectify the situation, the Department of Children and Families that overlooked all of this and messed up. And of all those people who made a mistake, there's only one facing a life without parole sentence, and that's the 12-year-old kid.
So rather than have the child accountable to society and institutions, how do we change that and have society and its institutions accountable to the child? Thank you very much for your patience. I do want you to know that I'm going to be exploring doing workshops in different countries to see what tools can be brought, what exists there. I'm always available. I answer emails promptly. Books are available, and you've been very generous with your time. I hope you follow these, us on social media.
Thank you, Richard. And now we'll be hearing from Kasie Lee.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Richard, for capturing all of those powerful images over the years and really telling the stories of these youth. So my name is Kasie Lee, and I'm a district attorney in San Francisco. Can everyone see this presentation?
Yes, looks good, Kasie.
So I'm a district attorney here in San Francisco, and for those of you in the audience who are not familiar with how our system is, there are 58 counties in California, and each county has their own prosecutor, which is the district attorney. And in San Francisco, we are both a city and a county, and that is what I do here. I am with the district attorney's office in the juvenile unit. I'll also say that prior to this job, I was I represented youth in the same system, in the juvenile justice system for many years. And it was really in that capacity that I grew to understand and appreciate the stories of these youth. And as one of the mentors that I had before stated, and I really agree with this, it's really in that capacity that one can appreciate and taste the salt of the client's tears. And so that experience has really informed what I do now. And I am, as I said, in the juvenile unit, and there I review cases that come in. So when young girls and boys come into the system, I review the cases and decide whether or not there is sufficient evidence to bring charges with them and bring them into our juvenile justice system. And in my work here at the district attorney's office, as I encounter the girls that come into our system, I've seen that almost all, the large majority, if not all, are CSEC, are part of the CSEC population, are CSEC victims or at risk. And so that's really a lot in line with what you just heard from Richard earlier when the director of a residential program said all 88 girls in her program had were sexually abused at some point in their lives. And that's consistent with what we see here in our system. And when I say CSEC, what that stands for is the commercial sexual exploitation of children. Other commonalities that we see in the girls or among the girls in our system and CSEC youth is the first is that they are crossover children. And what that means is within California, we have two systems dealing with youth. One is the dependency or our child welfare system. And then one is the delinquency system when the youth are accused of committing a crime. So within the child welfare system, the children are brought into that system when there are allegations and findings of abuse, neglect, and abandonment. And that's what we see with a lot of the girls that come in into the delinquency system later on in their lives, is that there is this history of being foster children in the child welfare system, a history of being abused, severe neglect, abandonment, and so on. And then in line with that, another commonality we see is mental health issues. So with this history of abuse, neglect, and abandonment, it isn't surprising that we see that the youth coming in suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, anxiety, and depression. That is something that is very common among the girls who come into the juvenile justice system. The third thing that we see that I didn't know before, but it's quite common also, is generational trauma. And that's that when there is a little more digging into your youth's past, the girls' history and past, we often find that the mothers of these youth were also a part of the dependency system, also part of the child welfare system, and that they were victims of abuse, neglect, and abandonment. And so this is kind of a vicious cycle. Unfortunately, in California, for a long time, we were criminalizing the victims of these young victims of sexual exploitation. So when CSEC youth were forced to sell their bodies, and there were adults who were profiting from this exploitation, it was actually considered a crime. So I think Patty Lee and Michelle DeYoung, who you will hear from later on, will tell you that it wasn't too long ago that we were seeing youth handcuffed and being brought into the juvenile court for the crime of prostitution, even though many within the system, many in the courtroom, were kind of aware of the sad reality that these youth were victims, that they were being exploited, but then still charged with a crime. And just that very act, even though some will say that well, this intervention is necessary to protect them. The act of bringing them into the system, handcuffing them, and as you can see, putting them into these cells in juvenile hall with no windows and being forced to follow all different types of rules, like not being able to lay down and so on for hours. That really just re-traumatizes them, and it brings into question, is this the proper intervention for these youth? So in January 1st of 2017, the Senate Bill 1322 went into effect in California, and it said we are no longer going to criminalize this act. We are no longer going to penalize the young girls who are being exploited. So now, as it stands, we cannot charge youth, girls who are under 18 for prostitution or loitering with the intent to prostitute. They may be detained for the short period of time so that law enforcement can connect them to services so that they can get the help that they need. And then the second thing that we have in our system is Penal Code Section 236.23, and this is specific to San Francisco. So a lot of the youth coming in now, a lot of the girls, even though we no longer charge for the acts of prostitution and loitering with the intent to prostitute, some of them may still be, and what we've seen is be forced to engage in other acts, other conduct that are in violation of the law, but may be as a result of their status as a human trafficking victim, as a CSEC victim. And so it's actually a defense if there is evidence to support that their act was the direct result of being a human trafficking victim, and they had a reasonable fear of harm at the time of the act. And that's something that we will consider when these cases come before us. And there's something else that I didn't put here, and those are vacatur laws, meaning that if there was a conviction or a petition that was sustained for an act, and this will apply for both adults and youth, but for an act that was a direct result of being a human trafficking victim, there is a form of relief where these victims can go back and petition to vacate their convictions or vacate the finding of the sustained petition. And that's important if there are immigration issues at stake. We know that a lot of, sometimes, not a lot, but sometimes in coming to coming to America, coming to the States, some families and some individuals will seek the help of people or agencies to bring the young people over. And once they're brought over, they're told that, well, you now owe us this amount of money, and you know, in order to pay off that money, you have to do these acts. And so some of these individuals are engaging in conduct that will bring them in violation of the law. And as it would turn out later on, it was because they were human trafficking victims. So there is a form of relief there as well. And then recognizing that this is a problem in our city, our San Francisco has set up a multi-agency protocol. So within the child welfare system, within the public defender's office, the child welfare system, public defender's office, the district attorney's office, and also other agencies that specifically work with CSEC victims, we have started regular meetings and putting together a protocol so that we can all work together and communicate in helping these young girls. And then within my office, the district attorney's office, we also set up our own protocols. So we have a crime strategies unit that will kind of probe into, do a little more investigation and see if we can locate the individuals and charge the individuals that are exploiting these girls. We changed our vulnerable victims policy to include not just young people who are named victims in cases, but also recognizing that young people can come into our system as defendants, as minors charged with offenses, and yet still be victims of CSEC. And so that's all I have for today, but if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me at this email address.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much, Kasie. And now we'll hear from Michelle.
Oops. Can everyone see me, Josh?
Yep, looks good.
All right. Hey, y'all. I would like to tell you about some of my experiences. I'll not use any of my clients' names or their exact story in order to protect their confidentiality. A little bit about how I work. I'm blunt, passionate, fierce advocate, and authentic. I've learned that change happens when we invest in one another, and when we don't, our youth suffer. This story is about relationships. I talk to dozens of people every day from all levels of our societal ecosystem. Now let me warn you, my work is full of chaos, so strap in. I'm tired because last night I dealt with a situation.
Sorry about that, Michelle. That was on my end. Yep, sorry about that.
Yeah, I'll start. So I'm tired because last night I dealt with a situation where a father called the cops on my client Diamond. Why? Well, because Diamond didn't clean her room. Her dad is schizophrenic. I spoke with the cop at length. He was shockingly nice. We worked together to get my client to a safe place for the night. I had a stroke of luck. Not all cops are this collaborative. The cop told the dad that he can't arrest Diamond for not cleaning her room. Before the cop and I end the call, I tell him thanks and that I appreciated his collaboration. I spend an hour following up on calls and emails. Then 9 a.m. rolls around and there are several new kids in custody. So I go up to Juvenile Hall to do intakes. We at the Public Defender's Office meet with youth as quickly as we can. We walk them through their rights in great detail and tell them the roles of the district attorney, the probation officer, and the Public Defender's Office, laying out how what they say and who they say it to can be used for or against them. We also help them understand that the Public Defender's Office is on their side and that what they say is held by attorney-client privilege. For my first intake, I meet with Leah. As we begin to talk, I see that she is in a psychotic state. She tells me how in her cell last night, she was watching the walls bleed. As we are talking in the visiting unit, another girl comes in. Leah gets up and starts to walk towards the girl and gets verbally aggressive. Leah doesn't actually know the girl. I do my best to divert her and work with the juvenile hall staff to get Leah back to the girls' unit as quickly as possible. I call the mental health service for youth in custody and explain what happened. My goal is to get her qualified mental health help as quickly as possible. The counselor up in juvenile hall do not have extensive mental health training, and there are no mental health staff permanently on the units. Unfortunately, this becomes a battle between the Public Defender's Office wanting her sent to the hospital and probation wanting to keep her in juvenile hall. We eventually are able to get Leah to the hospital. She is then transferred to a psychiatric hospital and will end up being there for about 3 months. With continued care, her mental health stabilizes about a year later, and it's amazing. She's incredibly smart and highly motivated. Unfortunately, she is sent to a group home where a psychiatrist derails his progress, taking her off her successful drug regimen. Leah's now on the streets. My girls show me videos of her from time to time, and it breaks my heart because I think about what her life could have been. I finished 2 more intakes, which go a great deal smoother, and head down to court. I have a couple of kids on today. The first is Ronisha. Ronisha is supposed to be keeping in touch with her probation officer and going to school, the basics. But I haven't been able to get a hold of Ronisha for a couple of weeks, which isn't good. If she doesn't show up, probation will likely take her back into custody when they see her next. This is when I sometimes think about pulling out my hair. Ronisha's mother doesn't have the ability to parent, not necessarily because she doesn't want to, but because she's a product of her environment and also raised in the criminal justice system. Her school can't support her, not because they don't want to, but they just don't have the capacity to do so. What is so frustrating is that how can the court expect the youth to do well in school when school isn't provided with resources? Ronisha's principal just told me that the government is cutting their funding again. Ronisha is always also being failed by the therapeutic services that she is ordered to participate in. The therapeutic agency hires young social workers with little to no experience. Our youth need trauma therapy, trauma-informed therapy, which they don't really get. You'd have to pay for that. To top it all off, her probation officer has no concept of how to actually work with Renisha. Their response is paternalistic, which is an institutional norm within the criminal justice system. Once again, how can this young person succeed when the system and her life is broken? As one might expect, the judge issues a warrant for Renisha. Chantal's case is being heard next. Chantal is currently in custody, and the judge will rule that she will serve out her juvenile time by remaining in custody. This is happening because she's almost 18, has failed every group home, and has nowhere else to go. She will be released on her 18th birthday, which is next month. Things unfortunately don't get better for her. Tina's case is on calendar, just so the judge can hear what progress is being made for stable housing. Tina's case is interesting solely because the Public Defender Office, District Attorney Office, Child Welfare Department, and a community organization and other stakeholders are working together to move away from criminalizing sexually exploited youth. This is actually new and pretty cool. Tatiana, my last case of the day, is probably the only one I don't have to stress about. Her court should go pretty quickly. We hang for a while and talk about life while we wait for court. We talk about her dysfunctional and emotionally abusive family, as well as her art. She's actually an amazing artist. I found this out not from her, of course, but because I spent so much time at her school. Her art teacher pulled me aside and said Tatiana can make real money if she will continue to pursue her art. Art is where she can explore her personal experiences and be lost in creativity. It's a solo act for her, the one place where she finds peace. Tatiana has chosen to stay a part of the juvenile system because she doesn't want to go home. It's sad that Tatiana has to look to the criminal justice system to attempt to have a normal childhood by being raised in group homes. As I wait for Tatiana's case to be called for court, there are a flurry of text message, emails from different schools, therapists, probation officers, attorneys, my clients, and parents. There are fires I have to put out and community connections I have to make. However, Dina just called me and told me she got a job. I get one text from Alexa's teacher and it's not good. She said that Alexa stormed out of the classroom and is cursing up and down the hall. I'm grateful that the school staff called me rather than the probation officer. They most likely call me because I'm at school all the time. Some schools, however, use the threat of calling my clients probation officers to try and gain control. And I think we can all guess how that ends up going. Not well. So after Tatiana's court is finished, I run to my office, grab my keys, and head to Alexa's school. When I get there, I see her outside cursing and yelling at people. Now, my girls know I'm no pushover and that I will not tolerate disrespect. I show them respect and expect them to do the same. I tell her to stop yelling and be respectful while I hear everyone's story. It's about a phone, which made me actually want to bang my head against the wall. I turn to Alexa and say, "You made me drive all the way here because you lost your control over a phone." I pinch my nose and look to the sky and say, "Why me?" I often purposely get a little dramatic with my responses in a comical way in order to lighten the mood. Alexa says to me, "Michelle, don't make me smile. I'm mad." Now I have to laugh and say, "You do know how ridiculous that is." The school rule is she can't use the phone, but the staff member made an exception, showing the rule is an absolute. My youth test out everyone's boundaries, not to rebel or act out because they're trying to find a solid wall, but because they're trying to find a solid wall. Something that they can identify and hold and know won't budge. Something that makes sense and is always constant. They're looking for safety. Thankfully, I was able to de-escalate Alexa and avoid probation being called. Alexa and I talk again when she got out of school, and we end up talking about the conflict she had with her mother that morning. One thing I've learned through the years of working in this system is that most of my girls don't know how to process emotions or even know what they are. I often have to explain this to those who choose to work with my clients. Most of my girls can't describe to you what being embarrassed, anxious, sad, happy, or vulnerable feels like. When we ask, they most often say, "I'm irritated or angry." Those are the only emotions they know and are the easiest to feel. That's how they have survived. Since I'm out in the city, I figured I might as well make the rounds to my other girls' schools. As I'm driving, I see Tamia walking towards her school. I pull her and say, "Get in the car." It's 1 p.m. One would think she would be in class. Now, this girl, I don't think she's ever sat through a single class. She can't really read and comes from a dysfunctional family that can't gain control over her. She has a long history with the child welfare system. We get to school and I ask her what she plans to do. She said something along the lines of walking the halls. Once again, I find myself pinching my nose and my girl smiles. I suggest we go to the school's wellness center, which is kind of like a community center that is focused around calming young people. I sit with her for a while and I help her read through some of her social studies work. By some miracle, the wellness staff and I are able to convince Tamia to go to her special education reading class. Collaboration works. I go and visit more schools. 2 of my girls aren't at school, and I talk to both of their counselors in order to try and brainstorm ways to getting them engaged. We talk about their behaviors during school, and I often have to explain that their behaviors are symptoms of complex trauma, sometimes compounded by learning disability. I always express my appreciation and respect for their work because they often aren't supported or valued. I leave the school and I'm starving. I pick up my lunch and I'm eating peacefully in my car when my phone rings. I see it's from a therapist at Jessica's group home. I know it's not going to be good. I answer the phone and I hear a lot of unpleasant dialogue and raised voices. The therapist proceeds to tell me that Jessica dragged the couch out of the house, drenched it with a hose, and is currently on top of the van, jumping up and down. I pinch in my nose again. I ask the therapist to put me on speakerphone. Now, group homes are great in theory, but often fall short in practice. Society does not invest in a bottom-up method. It doesn't invest in the communities who are supposed to be caring for these young people. Most group home staff don't have adequate training in trauma-informed care, child development, and harm reductive methods. Funnily enough, one of my clients just told me the same thing the other day. Oftentimes, my girls end up failing at group homes, which leads them right back to juvenile hall. This would end up being a 45-minute phone call. I'm first grateful that the group home staff decided to call me, and not Jessica's probation officer. They have learned that the probation officer is a big trigger for Jessica and will just probably make matters worse. I've invested time in getting to know the staff at the group home because I want to be able to help them as much as I can. I want them to know that they can always call me. As I hang up the phone, I get the feeling that the group home is going to call Jessica's probation officer. Not because they want to, but because they have to. Jessica will end up back in custody, and the cycle continues. Now I have to get back to my office as I'm working on 2 reports. One report is to help get Natasha's case dismissed with the support from her probation officer, actually, and to also help with her immigration case. Natasha has an extensive sexual assault history. About a year ago, she was gang raped, and she actually made a report with her child welfare social worker, which is not common. Later, Natasha finds out that her social worker wrote a report saying that he didn't believe her because she didn't cry when she were told the details of her assault. The police read that report, and no known effort was made to identify the perpetrators. Too often, those of color have their words discounted, especially young women of color. I would sometimes take Natasha to school and pick her up after so she would feel safe. There's something to be said for the tradition of being dropped off at and picked up from school. It's like this sacred moment when we feel cared for and loved. Happily, we were actually able to get her case dismissed, as well as get her a green card. My second report is a release plan for Sasha. Probation in the district attorney's office is trying to send Sasha to an out-of-state group home without first exploring options in state or if there's anyone who would be willing to care for her. This happens more often than it should. I start calling family members and community programs to start formulating a plan and a report. that could best support my client. 4 p.m. rolls around, and I decide to finish my day by going up to the juvenile hall to hang out with one of my girls, Latasha. We just sit and talk about anything and everything. Latasha has an extremely tragic story. She was sexually abused by her uncle and has been a victim of sex trafficking. I just let her lead the conversation where she wants. I don't always spend my time digging for information. It's important to just talk and listen. Latasha's case is frustrating because she is shared between the juvenile system and the child welfare system. The child welfare system just said they can't help her and feels that her needs will be better served in juvenile court. Their words. So rather than acknowledging their past failures and look to new methods of care, they think the best course of action is to criminalize her. How does that make any sense? Anyways, the clock strikes 5 p.m. and I tell Latasha and the other girls in the unit goodbye. When I get down to my office, I check my email one last time. I get an email telling me that one of my girls, now 22, died of an overdose. She was arrested for prostitution when she was about 13. Thankfully, the police can no longer do that. It took her forever, more than 3 months, to trust me. When I first met her in custody, we would just sit in silence for a while, looking out the window. I found that she became more comfortable and less jumpy if she had somewhere to look out to, almost like she could daydream. Finally, one day, she asked to talk to me, and the floodgates opened. She ended up telling me her life story, and it's tragic. Since leaving the system, she had many struggles and would call her old attorney and I off and on, just to chat. It had been a while since we had heard from her, and when I got that email, I wasn't surprised, but my heart was broken for her. The world failed her. She's one of the sweetest people I've ever known. The last memory I have of her is taking her grocery shopping. She called me to say she didn't have any money for food. We made a meal together and just hung out and talked about a lot of things. 7 p.m. comes around and I tell her I have to go. She pleads with me to stay. After reading the email, I just sit there for a moment and then end up driving home with a heavy heart, thinking about how grateful I am that I was able to know her, and saddened that all our systems, failed her. I've only lost 2 of my kids, and I consider myself lucky. Those who work with young people who identify as males aren't so lucky. As I drive home along the ocean, I look forward to the weekend when I'll be taking 3 of my girls hiking to where there's actually still hope. What I've learned through the years of working in the criminal justice system is the importance of relationships with individuals and institutions. In the criminal justice system, you're working with fractured individuals and fractured institutions. People ask how we can change the criminal justice system. Well, I first say we have to acknowledge that this system was created from racial institutions, because right now, 99% of my clients are young people of color. Second, I say we have to invest in the social capital of communities, truly invest in people, believe in the knowledge of the collective. Now, I'm not perfect. I mess up a lot, and sometimes think I know more than I actually do. But one thing that I'm good at is loving my girls. I tell them they deserve to be loved with no expectation, that they matter, if not to themselves, then to me. I tell them that no matter how much hair they make me want to pull out of my head, I'll always be there, and that they should know that someone loves them without conditions. At the end of the day, my girls deserve a world that values, loves, and supports them. This is what motivates me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, first, Richard, for that really powerful presentation, and then Kasie and Michelle for illuminating the context, the legal context, and then hearing the voices of the girls, your clients there, Michelle. So I think we just have time for a couple questions. Patty, if you want to ask the first one we got from the audience.
Thank you, everyone. I feel so inspired by the powerful presentations, and it really gives us resolve to continue working together to make life better for our youth. But we have a question, and as a guardian ad litem for over 3 years, I've seen how underfunded and overstretched the services and staff providing those services to children are. What would be the most impactful way to fix or change this so meaningful support and services so that it can be provided to both the children and those around them who act as the primary caregivers to affect lasting change for them? So I'm going to direct that question to Michelle in terms of possible services, and Richard in terms of the youth perspective based on your work.
Thanks, Patty. So that was quite the question.
It was quite.
I mean, I think that, you know, I think my basic answer, honestly, would be truly building relationships and getting to know all the stakeholders and institutions, because, you know, I think sometimes we like to talk through ideals rather than really getting on the ground and talking to people that actually know what's going on in the community. And really is to humble yourself. The only reasons why I've sort of gained knowledge is by acknowledging that I really don't know a whole lot. So, you know, I've found success within recently. You know, the cool thing about San Francisco is that we're kind of all focused on about having a more collective view of truly helping, because obviously these things don't work. And, you know, I think we have a pattern within kind of Western culture to have this top-down method of change, which really doesn't lead to change. And it's really going from the bottom up. And I think a big thing that we can all do is, you know, the best thing to start, especially, you know, right now with the Black Lives Matter movement, is educating yourself. There's such an opportunity and wealth of knowledge from people that actually know what they're talking about. And I think the big thing is to do that, and then actually just get involved in your local community, talk to people, see how you can help, and really engage in dialogue. There is power in dialogue. So I hope that sort of answers.
No, it does. Very well. Thank you. Richard?
I've spent the last 15 years listening to teenagers. They're incredibly lonely, and I simply try to filter out what they're trying to say and give them to people that may not have access to them, may have already demonized them. So I think it is, as Michelle said, trying to open up a dialogue and cleansing the stories in the sense that teenagers can babble a lot. I try to simplify it and try to convince anybody in the world of policymaking to say, if these were your kids, if these are our kids, how do you deal with them? How would you want them dealt with? And I don't think there's anybody on the planet that would imagine that these kids benefit from being put in these institutions.
Thank you, Richard. There is one more question, and that is obviously, Richard, based on your powerful presentation. We know that art can create positive changes as it intersects with the juvenile justice system. And I'd like to know from all of our panelists here, what are Richard's strategies for advocacy? And Kasie and Michelle, do you see art as a tool for advocacy in your daily work? Kasie, would you like to answer that first?
Sure. I do see art and specifically the photographs by Richard as an advocacy tool, just because they can, I mean, you know, it conveys such a powerful story, and it's one picture tells so much more than you know, what any of us can say, because in a lot of these cases we're not hearing from the youth themselves, so the stories that we're relaying, they're kind of secondhand, and so these pictures, art, are much more powerful.
Thank you. Michelle?
Yeah, so I sort of piggyback, you know, A lot of my girls actually write poetry, and I try to encourage them to share it and even read it in court. And a couple of my girls have, and really everyone stops and listens, because I think what was being told by Richard earlier is that when kids are in court, they're actually viewed as adults. They're not humanized. And my job is to humanize them, and they're able to do that themselves when they could read their art. And I've had several girls who paint and participate in art class, and I actually try to encourage them to, when they go to school, is to go to art class, because often they don't know how to express themselves. So I think whether or not that's being shown, it is a tool for them, and when they feel comfortable to share it, people are normally in awe. And I had one of my girls' art pieces shown in a gallery, which was amazing, and she was incredibly proud of. So not only can it move other people, but it gives them a sense of accomplishment. So it kind of has this world effect, and if you can say that.
Thank you, Michelle. We have one final question, and this is for Richard. Can you explain how you engage with young women or girls who have experienced severe traumas in their lives, and how you, I'm sorry, but I just lost.
Sorry, it's in the answered tab there now. I
why
can
don't-
finish asking it quickly.
Yeah. Lost the question, sorry.
Sorry about that. So Richard, the question is, how do you deal with girls who have experienced severe trauma? How do you get them to open up to you and trust you in such a short amount of time? And how do you get them to engage in this project that might be foreign to them?
Really difficult, and I'm sure that it's a longer discussion I would have with anybody in the audience. I'm not quite sure. I don't want to re-traumatize them. But when I start a conversation with a girl, it may be completely antithetical to any ethical practice that anybody on the panel may think is legitimate, but often I'll say to them, how old were you when you were first assaulted? And it makes the assumption that I already have some idea as to who they are and what their background is, and I'm sympathetic. Also remember that I knock on the door and I'm sitting on the ground, and I'm not a young person of color. And if the girls of color, often that's the one that has assaulted them. So I'm so distant and so foreign and so sympathetic, and I keep my mouth shut in so many ways, and they have power above me, so I'm not a threat. But I'm very careful not to re-traumatize them and tell them, please don't talk about anything that makes you uncomfortable. But that's a scary, scary world for me.
I'm sure. Thank you all again so much for sharing, and we would love to continue this dialogue going forward. So once again, I've put Richard Ross's contact information in the chat, so please follow him, follow his work. We've seen that, this is really crucial, bridging, bringing art into the justice system and illuminating areas that often are, hidden behind legal language. Just as a reminder, there are some upcoming symposium events in the International Symposium. So in a couple of weeks, we have findings and calls to justice with a focus on Indigenous girls and youth in Canada. The presenter, Krista Big Canoe from the Aboriginal Legal Services of Ontario. I've put the link to register for that in the chat as well, so please go ahead and register now if you're interested in these conversations. We will also have panels on sex trafficking on February 23, and then 2 that we'll be finalizing a date soon on sexual violence, and then on this issue as it is seen in China. So thank you all so much for attending. With that, I will conclude, and we'll be sending a follow-up email tomorrow that'll have some highlights from today's event. Thank you all so much, and have a good day.